Hi, and welcome to week 7 of Leadership and Admin. Trust that you're enjoying the course, that your learning has been helpful to you, and that the discussion posts, the case studies, and the team assignment are all going well for you. Today we're going to look at 3 critical components, important components of leadership effectiveness, and that is this notion of communication, and then motivation and empowerment. Each of these are very important aspects of leadership effectiveness. In a VUCA world that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, we need vision to offset volatility, we need understanding to offset uncertainty, we need clarity to offset complexity. And clarity arises through effective communication. And Richard L. Daft in your textbook will talk about what are the rich channels of communication and how do leaders influence through effective communication. Even when you're not directly communicating, because you might be in a large organization as a leader, and you may not be directly communicating with those whom you are leading, how do you have what Daft calls ghost influence, that you actually then influence through others to influence through communication the entire organization? So our learning objectives for this week then are simple. Number 1, we want you to recognize and apply the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. How are people motivated, and what is the implication of intrinsic versus extrinsic rewards? We want you to appropriately tap into the motives that induce people to take action and accomplish important goals. And remember, leadership is about influencing people to achieve a common purpose. Leaders and followers acting together to achieve a common purpose. And then we want to talk about how you motivate others by meeting their higher level needs. And of course, we'll look at Maslow's hierarchy, and I really appreciate the way in which Daft has translocated Maslow's hierarchy into the business environment, and you'll see that in your textbook. It's really helpful. So continuing on with our learning objectives, I want to just highlight that we're also going to apply the needs-based theory of motivation and understand how the concept of equity applies to motivation. We talked about this as well in last week's module with this idea of procedural justice. We also want to describe the psychological and structural elements of empowerment and how empowerment contributes to motivation. When people feel that they're agents and not just passive participants, that has a tremendous impact on their motivation to accomplish the shared purpose of the organization. We also want to apply job characteristics model to how do we enrich people's jobs using the job characteristics model. And then we want to identify factors that play a role in employee engagement. I was at a Imagine Your Workplace conference 4 weeks ago, and 2 of the speakers spoke about how their role in their large organization, their focus was employee engagement and how they structured that and developed that. It's vitally important in today's business organization where we have reported low levels of engagement. And then how do we build a thriving workforce by giving people a sense of making progress toward meaningful goals? And how do we celebrate those goals and the accomplishment of those goals as leaders? And then in terms of communication, how leaders act as communication champions and sense makers or sense giving, which is really important, a really important role of leadership. We're going to use key elements of effective listening, this notion of active listening and the 6 elements of active listening as a really important communication tool for leaders. People are motivated and respond to leadership when they believe that they're being heard and listened to, and that their concerns are understood. How do we use candor appropriately to improve communication effectiveness and recognize and apply the difference between dialogue and discussion, and what is the difference? And we'll look at that in the module this week. And then incorporating metaphor and storytelling. Great leaders are also great storytellers, and there are a number of consultants out there in the business environment today who help leaders learn how to shape stories effectively. People respond to stories. People identify with stories. People place themselves into stories. And the power of metaphor and the power of stories is so vital in our world today. We want to talk about selecting appropriate communication channels, and I talked about channel richness, and Daft really drills down on that in your textbook. You want to communicate in a way that persuades and influences others. Your job as a leader is to help make sense, but it's also to motivate, to persuade. If you believe the vision is good and you believe that the objectives of the organization are good, you want to motivate others to achieve that in a meaningful way. And then effectively communicate during times of stress or crisis. In times of stress and crisis, people need sense-making, sense-giving, communicated from the leadership. It's vitally important. So what is communication? And I wish we had time to drill down on Bell's model of communication and the issue of semantic interference and how culture impacts that, how many things impact that. But let's just talk about what is communication. Communication is a process by which information and understanding are transferred between a sender and a receiver. The sender sends the message, the receiver receives the message. Semantic interference, though, is what happens when in between, when sometimes the message a person sends is not always the message that a person receives. And so you can see that here in this great graphic that Daft has in your textbook. And we communicate both verbally and non-verbally through our words, but also through symbols, through body language. And then that message is interpreted by the receiver. And of course, along the way, we have this thing that we call semantic interference. And again, I wish I had time to drill down on that, but maybe you can do more work on that as you work through this week's lesson. So as we think about the traditional role of a manager, is as an information processor. Managers have a communication responsibility in directing and controlling an organization. Managers need to process information, but they also need to effectively disseminate that information so that people know what is going on and what their roles are. They establish themselves at the center of information networks to facilitate the completion of tasks. So leaders are communication champions, and the question leaders always want to ask themselves as they do that is, how do we embed the message? How do we ensure that the message is, first of all, common throughout the organization, and secondarily, that it's embedded, that it is consistently understood and acted upon throughout the organization? And then this notion of sense-giving, in helping people understand what the organization is about and how they fit into that process. So we have leaders communicating through internal and external sources, these strategic conversations where we create an open climate for people to be able to ask questions, to listen, to communicate with candor, with openness, to dialogue. Well, this is what I think. What do you think? And how does that affect the vision and the accomplishment of our purpose together? And so that's all facilitated by the leadership of the organization as communication champions. Communication is always purpose-directed. We're directing attention to our vision and our values, to our desired outcomes, and we use persuasion to move people to that. And then methodologically, what are the channels through which we communicate, both verbally and non-verbally? You can read through what strategic conversation is in your textbook. It's communication that takes place across boundaries and hierarchical levels. And when we lead strategic conversations, we ask questions and actively listen to others. We want to understand their attitudes. We don't just listen to them, we listen for them, and we try to understand what is the person's values and beliefs that are being articulated in this conversation. We set the agenda for the conversation by underscoring key themes, and we select the right communication channels to facilitate dialogue. Email is not a great channel for dialogue. Face-to-face conversation that's well structured is a good channel for dialogue. Thanks so much.